The next one is challenge the politicians. This is election year, only comes around every 3 years. Challenge all the politicians, whatever party they're from, and have very clear, concrete demands when we do challenge them. Don't allow any room for or any loopholes where they can fudge and appear to agree and actually not. Pin them down. And then motivate your generation to vote. Your generation is known well for not voting, or your age group is known well for not voting, sort of in every generation actually, and people kind of start voting maybe when they get a bit older. If your whole generation voted, you could change the outcome of the election. That's possibly the most important thing for you to do over the next 3 months, is get people on the roll, get them to understand why voting matters, and get them voting, and get them thinking about who they're going to vote for and why, and challenging them. Because actually, politicians only respect one thing, and that's numbers of votes. If you can show that you've got large numbers of people sharing your view and wanting to make a difference, you will affect politicians. Remember when Jerry Brownlee wanted to dig up national parks for gold and coal and various minerals, and he wanted to get rid of Schedule 4, which protected them? And there were 40,000 people marched in Auckland, and the government was completely nonplussed. They had no idea so many people cared. And so they turned over the policy really quickly. Key just stepped in and said, okay, we're not going to do it then. So numbers really do matter. The sixth one is hold events, be creative. Turn up where things are happening and make an alternative event happen. You've got lots of ideas about how to do that. The seventh one is live your principles. There's no point in talking about a low-carbon, sustainable society if in our daily actions we do the opposite. Challenge your own consumerism. I had to think very hard about this conference, and I said, no, I can't fly down specially to speak to a conference like this, but I'll do it on Skype. It's not as good. It's not as good as being there with you. It's not as good as being able to see your faces and answer your questions and the sort of buzz you get in the room at a conference. But it's still better than nothing. And I'm going to do a lot of Skype from now on, because we just can't fly airplanes every time we need to communicate. The eighth one is look after your mates. This is going to get tough, and we have to look after each other as well as ourselves. Stay positive and stay non-violent. The moment we get into violence, they've won. You lose all respect of middle New Zealand, the people you're trying to convert, and you just become sort of outsiders. And be respectful even of the planet destroyers, so that they can't pigeonhole you and dismiss you as violent or terrorists or all the other things we might sometimes feel we'd like to be. The ninth one is keep on challenging the plan that you made. It won't be perfect. You need to keep reviewing it. Are we still operating according to the plan? Is it working? How does it need to change? The last one is don't get distracted by trivia, because lots of people will try and distract you. So keep on thinking about your priorities. You know, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, big friendly letters on the wall that said prioritise. Actually, I think it said don't panic, but my big friendly letters on the wall have always been prioritise, because that's the hard thing to do when you've got far more to do than you can. So there are things happening all over the world. We're not alone here. A number of the big international banks have decided not to fund mountaintop removal coal mining any longer, the most damaging sort. Some of them are not funding coal-fired power stations any longer in the US and in America. There's a massive march being planned on Washington against the pipeline that they're planning to take the petroleum from the tar sands in Alberta down to Texas, because the tar sands should be left where they are, just as coal should be left where it is. So there's a lot happening. It's all over the world, and we just need to get active here in New Zealand. So finally, your generation can do it. Some of my generation are here and willing to help if and when you need us. You only have to ask. We're not going to breathe down your necks or tell you what to do. But never, ever, ever give up.
That was incredible. Thank you so much. I will send you an email saying more, but thanks.
So thank you to Jeanette, who's gone. That was amazing, very inspirational. I'm sure we can all take something away with us from that. And also thank you to Ashton. That was really informative and interesting. So last but not least, we have Lloyd, and he is an Otago law student. I'm sure many of you know. He was part of the New Zealand Youth Delegation in 2009 and attended the Climate Change Conference in Copenhagen, and is also the coordinator for Generation Zero here in Dunedin. So, here we go.
What just happened here? Do we have any idea what just happened there? We've lost that, but I was thinking that I'd throw away my slides anyway. Oh no, let's go. Okay. In light of the slightly weird timing, I think I will mix this up a little bit and step away from the slides, because I know people might want to be away from here by 8:30. So what we'll do is after this, if you're desperate to get somewhere at 8:30, you can go, but we'll then have a question and answer session for people who are keen to stay. We've got the place booked for longer, so it's fine in that perspective. There's been a lot of talking from the front, so I'd like you guys all to just take 30 seconds and have a chat to the person next to you. This is going somewhere. So introduce yourself and have a chat about something tonight. Hands up who spoke to a girl. All right. 100 years ago, every single one of those girls wouldn't have been in this lecture theatre because women weren't allowed into university. And I think it's really important when we talk about issues like this to put them in context a little bit, because for all Bob's points about the immensity of the problems, the thing which you forget is that there have been so many changes over the last 100 years, and every time one of those changes happens, you just start to take it for granted. So it never occurred to anybody that for years, women just weren't allowed into university. If you wanted to do a law degree, you just weren't allowed to be a woman because it had really... Oh, exactly. But that's the perfection of the world we've got today, is that everyone can sit here and laugh about that. But no one was laughing when the first female lawyer was trained in Otago and they initially tried to kick her out of the law school because they just couldn't understand the notion that this girl had the brains to study law. Doctors in the beginning of the 20th century told their patients that if women were given positions of responsibility, their brains and their blood were too thin or not smart enough to cope with it. So the very people like Ashton who stand up here really respectfully and tell us about how they're going to help global health, were also telling women that they were too weak to do anything which actually counted. So my point there isn't to comment on, well, it is to say that those doctors were completely wrong in what they were doing, but it was also something which was completely normal at that time. And that's just the weird reality of the way society changes, is that you have people who try to produce movements, and you have a bunch of people who say, no, women are too dumb, or no, the climate isn't being affected, the world's a really big place. And so all of these people make steps to try and maintain the status quo, but what they forget is that there have been significant changes which have happened to the world and to the way society is run as we've gone through things. So I guess where we're sitting right now is the question of, is change possible? Because we've heard from Bob, we've heard from Jeanette, we've heard from Ashton, and themes of that are that there are two different visions we're staring down. One of those visions is your vision where we keep on exploiting the remaining reserves in the ground and lead ourselves to a position where there's a couple of breeding pairs down in Antarctica and not a lot else. The other vision is one where we take steps down that path, down a path towards greener energy, down a path towards reducing emissions. And that's not an easy thing to do. But my point by asking, is change possible, is to say to you which camp you sit yourself in. Because the perfection of the issue of climate change is that, and peak oil, it's not going to get any easier. It's only going to get harder. And so you might as well get on board as soon as possible before you become as ridiculous as these guys who, let me see here, these people thought that change wasn't possible. The diagram on the right is the logo for the Flat Earth Society. Diagram on the left is the Ku Klux Klan at a meeting. And both of those groups, like, you can't believe why anybody would support those groups, but people legitimately held to those beliefs, and then we look back and see that those beliefs were just absurd because of people like these guys who thought, yeah, change is possible. I'm only one person, but I am one person. And they took steps to do what they could within their own realities. And historically, we've probably made figures like Mandela and Gandhi bigger than they were. They probably weren't gurus. If you read Mandela, he says that he was just one part of a movement. And we like to make it simple and say, Mandela stood up and then changed the world. He waved his little magic wand and down fell apartheid. The reality is that those figures symbolise a group of people who came together and who took steps because they believed that they'd rather be standing up for human rights and equality than burning poles and calling themselves the Ku Klux Klan. So I guess the question is, though, specifically, why do I think that the climate chaos fits into this realm? And I don't think that I'm particularly qualified. Ashton and I were both rather nervous about putting students on the stand tonight, but we figured that given that we're the ones who are saying that there's reason to be optimistic, we might as well put our money where our mouth is. And I think for me, the main thing that makes me optimistic about climate change is these guys. That's a globe, but that globe is made up of thousands of mosaic images from people around the world. You can't get the zoom correctly because I downloaded a cheap, low-quality image. But but if you go to tickticktick.org, you can zoom in, and each of those continents there breaks up into the face of a person who's uploaded their face to the website to say, I support taking action on climate change, and I support global action on climate change. And when we were in Copenhagen, there was this weird dichotomy of governments who weren't doing a lot, your sort of depressing narrative, which we've heard a bit of tonight, and optimism of people. So 16 million people signed an agreement in Copenhagen calling for action. And my point is that there's this massive amount of people's movement out there. Yes, I'm not going to be a naive optimist and tell you that it's easy or that climate change is something which we can just wish away, because given that Bob knows a lot more than I do about big numbers, there are clearly some very big issues which we do need to deal with. But what I will say is that there's a massive groundswell of opinion, and it's not just people's movements on their own either. Recently, Australia passed a carbon tax, despite intensive lobbying from the coal industry. What was one of the crucial factors in the passing of that act? A 45,000-strong youth climate network called the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. They met with governments, they met with MPs from around the country, and they continuously said to the government, this is our future and we don't want you gambling it away. That's the point where it's nice to finish an inspirational talk and let everyone go home and pat themselves on the back and read about Mandela and think, oh, cool, that guy was real awesome. But I think Jeanette was good on this, and we don't want you guys to get away with just walking out of here with these bunch of speakers down front who said some nice stuff, and then an audience who sits there and watches, because the reality of what we're talking about here is that it's a problem which affects you sitting in the audience as much as it does me or Jeanette or Ashton. So the question for everyone tonight then is, how do we fit in? Where do we fit into this big picture?